As we already know here on this channel, life inside the British royal family is far from a fairy tale. Behind the perfect smiles, the gleaming crowns, and the lavish weddings broadcast on television, there is loneliness, scandal, and choices that come at a very high price. And if there is one story that reveals all of that, it is the story of Princess Margaret, the rebellious sister of Queen Elizabeth II. Margaret lived intensely. She loved passionately, and she married a man who, at first glance, seemed perfect for her. Antony Armstrong-Jones, the Earl of Snowdon. He was not a nobleman. He did not come from a royal family. But he brought something the princess could never find within palace walls: freedom, art, sensitivity, and a daring charm, a blend of intelligence and provocation. A photographer of rare talent, a brilliant designer, a modern man in a world trapped in ancient rituals. But, according to the gossip of the time, behind that sophisticated exterior and that magnetic gaze, there was also a seducer, volatile, and capable of hiding far too many secrets. For decades, his name would be tied to scandals, lovers, rumors, and even paternity revelations that would surface many years later. But who was the Earl of Snowdon, really? That is what you're going to discover today, here on the channel. So before we continue, leave your like, subscribe, and ring the little bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Today, we talk about him, Antony Armstrong-Jones, the Earl of Snowdon. He was born on March 7, 1930, in the elegant district of Belgravia in London. Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones entered the world surrounded by privilege, but also by emotional distance. Son of the respected Welsh lawyer Ronald Armstrong-Jones and the sophisticated Anne Massell, Tony, as his family called him, grew up between duty and appearances. His father, a serious and reserved man, was not prone to gestures of affection. His mother, cultured and ambitious, with strong artistic connections, the niece of the renowned stage designer Oliver Massell, seemed to reserve her warmth for the social circles she frequented. Tony's childhood unfolded among large houses, impeccable staff, and cold silences. When his parents divorced in 1935, before he had even turned 5, that already distant world completely fractured. Anne remarried quickly. This time, she climbed several rungs on the social ladder. Her new husband was Michael Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross. And so Anne became a countess, and Tony suddenly found himself living between two realities. On one side, the son of a Welsh lawyer. On the other, the stepson of a nobleman, in mansions where luxury was as natural as the absence of affection. Gossip claimed that Tony never overcame that contrast, that he felt like a second-class child, eclipsed by his half-siblings and pushed aside amid the frigid formalities of the aristocracy. His own family often called him the odd one in the nest. And perhaps it was there, among immaculate dining rooms and whispered conversations, that his desire was born to see the world through a lens, always at a distance, always observing. He was sent to boarding schools from a very young age. Eton, Cambridge, discipline, coldness. Everything seemed to mold him, to make him fit, to make him perfect, but Tony never fit in. And then, illness arrived. At 16, during a holiday in Wales, he contracted polio. He spent 6 months hospitalized at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary. 6 months. Practically alone. According to accounts, only his sister Susan visited him during that time, not his mother, not his father. No one else came. It was a profound loneliness, a mark he would carry forever, in his body and in his soul. Polio left his left leg atrophied, 1 inch shorter, and gave him a permanent, slight limp. But Tony transformed pain into style. He concealed the weakened leg with calculated elegance, and that touch of imperfection ended up intriguing everyone who met him. It was as if destiny itself were announcing what was to come, a man divided between charm and shadow, between talent and self-destruction. The boy who once felt rejected by his mother would grow up to challenge the conventions of an entire family, including the most powerful one in England. After leaving boarding school, Tony entered the University of Cambridge at the prestigious Jesus College to study architecture. For a time, it seemed he had found the right path, but the truth is that he was never a man meant to follow rules. In his second year, he failed his exams and watched as Cambridge's doors closed to him. For his parents, it was a disgrace. For him, a liberation. While his mother and new stepfather continued parading through the circles of the nobility, Tony decided to carve out a path of his own, one that blended art, aesthetics, and rebellion. It was then that he discovered photography. At first, he worked with small portrait sessions for theater and fashion, often thanks to the recommendation of his uncle, the celebrated Oliver Messel, whose set and costume designs captivated London. But soon, Tony's eye began to stand out. There was something different in his images, a sense of humanity, of imperfection, of intimacy that sharply contrasted with the rigid formalism of British photography at the time. His talent caught the attention of the renowned photographer Barron, who invited him to become his apprentice, first paid by the hour and later as his official assistant. It was the beginning of a meteoric career. By the 1950s, Tony had become an increasingly sought-after name. He photographed actresses, aristocrats, theater artists, and soon his work began appearing in the pages of Tatler, Queen, and Vogue. London's elite adored him, and that eccentric, bohemian photographer with the ironic gaze was turning into high society's favorite portraitist. But while his success grew, his personal life already carried the very ingredient that would follow him his entire life: scandals, passions, and rumors. Gossip whispered that after his studio sessions on Pimlico Road, Tony hosted parties drenched in music, champagne, and young models, gatherings that, for many, felt more experimental than social. Some claimed he possessed an irresistible charm, capable of seducing men and women with the same intensity. Others swore that beneath his elegance and easy smile lived an incurable loneliness. And perhaps they were all right. By the late 1950s, Armstrong-Jones was already a recognized figure on the British cultural scene. His photographs displayed a bold, informal, sometimes provocative style, one that stirred both criticism and admiration. In 1957, he had the privilege of photographing Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh during the Royal Tour of Canada, an accomplishment that would reshape the course of his career. Suddenly, that young outsider photographer, without noble origins, began orbiting the royal sphere itself. And it was there, in that world where formality mingled with fascination, that he crossed paths with the woman who would forever alter his life, Princess Margaret, the Queen's rebellious sister. She, intense and emotional, a lover of art and excess. He, the restless photographer who seemed to grasp the imperfect beauty of things. Their encounter was like a spark. At first, friendship and mutual admiration. He showed her his work, asked for her opinion. She invited him to dinners and quiet gatherings. But soon, what had begun as inspiration turned into passion. While the world still saw Margaret as the princess who had suffered for being unable to marry Peter Townsend, Tony appeared as a breath of freedom. He was not noble, he was not a diplomat nor a courtier, he was an artist. And perhaps that was precisely what captivated her. But it was also what turned their romance into a looming scandal. Inside the halls of Buckingham Palace, few believed that a photographer of ordinary origin could win the heart of a princess, much less walk down the aisle with her. But the improbable is often what most seduces destiny. And without knowing it, Antony Armstrong-Jones was on the verge of becoming the man who would place the British monarchy before the cameras and under judgment. It was the end of the 1950s. London was experiencing a surge of cultural energy unlike anything before. Jazz, fashion, theater, and photography seemed to beat to the same rhythm. And in the midst of that landscape of modernity and rebellion, two unlikely names were drawing ever closer: Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, and Antony Armstrong-Jones, the photographer who viewed the world with a free and provocative eye. But every love story within the British royal family comes wrapped in shadows, and this one would be no different. Margaret still carried in her heart the ghost of Peter Townsend, the man for whom she had defied everything, the church, parliament, and her own destiny. A forbidden love that time never erased, it only forced into silence. When Antony entered her life, he brought something she had almost forgotten: lightness, creativity, a spark of irreverence. He was the opposite of Townsend: modern, witty, unpredictable, and, according to gossip, dangerously seductive. The friendship between them grew quickly and discreetly. Tony photographed the princess at events and private dinners, showed her his projects, asked for her opinions. Between laughter and confidences, the line between art and emotion began to blur, though no one knew for certain whether it was love or simply an attempt to fill the void the past had left behind. The engagement was announced in February 1960, and to this day there are doubts about who proposed to whom. Some claim it was she, the princess, who took the initiative, a bold and highly unusual gesture within the royal family. Others insist it was Antony, fascinated by Margaret's mystery and power, who made the proposal. But nearly everyone agrees on one point. Shortly before the decision, Margaret had received a letter from Peter Townsend. In it, Townsend revealed that he was engaged to a young Belgian woman, Marie-Lucie Jaman, just 19 years old. It was a painful blow, and according to several accounts, the very day she received the letter, Margaret accepted Antony Armstrong-Jones' offer of marriage. Coincidence? Destiny? Or an act of heartbreak disguised as love? We will never know. What is certain is that Buckingham Palace officially announced the engagement, and with it, the British monarchy made history. Antony Armstrong-Jones would become the first commoner in nearly 4 centuries to marry a daughter of a king. The last time anything similar had happened was back in the 17th century. For the press, it was a revolution. For traditionalists, a scandal. A man without royal blood, an artist, a photographer, was about to enter the royal family. On May 6, 1960, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang with pomp and splendor. It was the first royal wedding ever televised, watched by more than 20 million people around the world. Princess Margaret appeared radiant, wrapped in lace and diamonds, while Antony, elegant and composed, held a calm gaze, almost impenetrable. Her smile seemed to conceal something between joy and doubt. His, as always, remained an enigma. The public saw a fairy tale, but those who knew them understood the truth. Behind the flawless ceremony stood 2 restless souls, each trying to heal wounds the other could not begin to understand. Margaret, perhaps, seeking a love that might make her forget. Anthony, perhaps, seeking recognition in a world that had never fully accepted him. The whole country was enchanted by the image of the smiling princess and the photographer who had dared to win the heart of a king's daughter. While the world gazed at a modern fairy tale, destiny was already writing the first chapter of a hidden scandal. Soon after the ceremony, the couple departed on a 6-week honeymoon through the Caribbean, a sunlit, luxurious, and seemingly joyful journey. But what no one knew was that at that very time, far away from them, a child was being born who would forever reshape the biography of Antony Armstrong-Jones. The little girl's name was Polly Fry, and she entered the world on May 28, 1960, barely 3 weeks after Anthony and Margaret's wedding. Officially, Polly was the daughter of Jeremy Fry, heir to the traditional Fry family, famous for English chocolates, and of his wife, Camilla Fry, both close friends of the Armstrong-Jones couple. But decades later, the truth would come to light. In 2004, a DNA test confirmed what had long been whispered in the discreet circles of high society. Polly Fry was, in fact, the biological daughter of Antony Armstrong-Jones. The scandal was enormous. The child had been born practically during the honeymoon of the Earl of Snowdon and the princess. And the rumors went even further. Some biographers and columnists suggested that Anthony had maintained an intimate relationship with both of the Frys, Camilla and Jeremy, hinting that their elegant trio of friendship extended far beyond social appearances. Nothing of the sort was ever proven, but the rumors survived across decades, turning that circle of friends into a kind of refined secret within the British aristocracy. Princess Margaret, of course, never spoke publicly about the matter, though some claim she knew and chose silence. Perhaps out of love, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because within monarchy there are truths that are never spoken aloud. Meanwhile, the couple's life rushed forward at a frenetic pace. Margaret and Anthony became the perfect portrait of swinging London, the London of the 1960s, glamorous, provocative, and modern. She moved among musicians and artists like the Beatles and Peter Sellers. He moved among photographers, designers, and the great figures of the fashion world. At the end of 1961, Margaret gave birth to their first child, David, who would inherit the title Viscount Linley and later become the second Earl of Snowdon. 3 years later, in 1964, Sarah was born, their second child, completing the public image of a happy family. But the perfect facade soon began to crack. Antony, now bearing the official title of Earl of Snowdon, had become the royal family's favorite portraitist and a symbol of Britain's artistic modernity. But behind the charm, he had begun to feel suffocated. Giving up a large part of his independent career to fulfill royal duties and submit to the rigid codes of monarchy clashed with his free spirit. Margaret, for her part, felt increasingly alone. Her husband lived surrounded by artists and models, traveling often, working late, attending parties where she was not always welcome. She responded with irony, sarcasm, and long nights of alcohol and cigarettes. People said that Kensington Palace, where they lived, was both a mansion and a prison, beautiful on the outside, cold on the inside. And so, the couple who had embodied modernity within the monarchy began to confront an old, inevitable dilemma: love strangled by appearances, rebellion crushed by tradition. But while the press still saw them as a dazzling couple, Anthony was already accumulating secrets. And the first of them, the existence of a daughter born in silence during the honeymoon, would be only the beginning of many that would later come to light. When the photographer Antony Armstrong-Jones received the title Earl of Snowdon in 1961, Everything seemed like the perfect happy ending to the modern fairy tale that had captivated the world. A commoner, an artist and provocateur, had conquered not only the heart of Princess Margaret, but also a place, however uneasy, within the British royal family. But as in every fairy tale, the shine did not take long to fade. In the corridors of Kensington Palace, where the couple now lived, not everyone saw him as an equal. Anthony, despite the title, had no royal blood. And in a monarchy where protocol and genealogy are sacred, that difference mattered. Accounts from the time claim that even some palace staff treated him with coldness, as if he could never truly belong to that world. For many, he was nothing more than the photographer who married the princess. And there was another detail that made everything even more complicated. Anthony was vain, very vain. He enjoyed being admired, being at the center of attention, being recognized for his talent and personal charm. Town and Country magazine once wrote that he seemed to openly relish the notoriety that marriage had brought him. And that hunger for the spotlight did not go unnoticed. The problem was that Margaret was the same. From a young age, she had been the star of the monarchy. Beautiful, elegant, quick-witted. The princess who enchanted the public and dominated every room with a single glance. She too wanted to shine, to be the focus, to be remembered. And now she shared the stage with a man who demanded the exact same space she did. The two began to clash, not only because of their temperaments, but because they were engaged in a true battle for the spotlight. Each wanted to be at the center of the scene. Each wanted to be the protagonist of their own story. As one biographer wrote, they were two stars in orbit, destined to collide. And that is precisely what happened. While Queen Elizabeth II tried to keep the balance and protect the public image of the family, Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, made little effort to hide his disdain. Philip, a practical, direct man, lover of sport and discipline, saw in Anthony everything he disliked. He considered him vain, affected, theatrical, always obsessed with his own image. Some say Philip even referred to him, with biting irony, as the drawing room intellectual, a polite way of suggesting he found him superficial. And that nickname, whispered through the palace corridors, made it clear that Snowdon would never be fully accepted within that circle of royal blood. But Anthony seemed unfazed. He responded with the same calculated detachment that had made him famous. He observed, photographed, and maintained that air of someone who always knows more than he says. He was the artist among aristocrats, the outsider who had slowly become indispensable. Meanwhile, his marriage to Margaret was beginning to fracture. What had once been passion had turned into competition. She accused him of coldness and selfishness. He pointed to her dramatics and jealousy. The arguments were intense, and the palace, once filled with laughter and music, soon held long silences and doors that slammed with force. Even so, in public, they remained the perfect couple of swinging London, the modern symbol of the monarchy. They attended exhibitions, dinners, and parties, mingling with Britain's artistic and cultural elite. It was common to see them beside celebrities, but the moment the camera stopped rolling, reality returned to sting. Anthony felt trapped in a gilded cage, suffocated by the weight of royal formalities. Margaret, in turn, felt increasingly isolated, convinced that the man for whom she had sacrificed stability no longer belonged to her, neither in body nor in soul. Behind the scenes of royalty, everyone sensed it. The marriage of the princess and the photographer had become a duel of mirrors. Two vain, talented, proud beings, each reflecting the worst in the other. And deep down, both knew that the passion that had once united them was turning into something entirely different, a silent war for attention, power, and affection. On the outside, everything still looked perfect. The Earl of Snowdon and Princess Margaret remained the monarchy's glamorous modern pair. He, the innovative and charismatic artist, she, the princess of magnetic beauty, a symbol of elegance and rebellion. But behind the doors of Kensington Palace, the glow of their marriage had begun to turn to poison. Antony and Margaret had become prisoners of a sickened love, built on passion, pride, and vanity. Both wanted to shine, and neither would accept standing in the other's shadow. He sought the same spotlight she had always enjoyed. She could not tolerate sharing the stage, and each, in their own way, fought for attention. The Earl of Snowdon was charismatic and intelligent. He knew how to win over the right people with a mix of charm and irony. And little by little, even within the royal family itself, he began to grow more admired. The Queen found him interesting, modern, with a unique artistic sensibility. The Queen Mother saw him as polite and attentive. Even the palace aides, who at first viewed him with suspicion for being a commoner, eventually succumbed to his magnetism. And for Margaret, that was unbearable. She felt that everyone, the family, the friends, the court, stood on his side, while she, born a princess, found herself isolated and misunderstood. That imbalance only fueled their disputes, turning every conversation into a silent contest for power. With the years, arguments became routine. Antony, cold and sarcastic, attacked with sharp words and calculated gestures. Margaret, impulsive and proud, responded with fury and tears. It was a domestic war, fought with irony and silence. They say that, in moments of deep irritation, he would leave cruel notes around the house, little provocations disguised as humor, slips of paper hidden between her books, lists with offensive remarks, even messages titled, "20 Reasons Why I Hate You." Among them, one became infamous. He had written that she looked like a Jewish manicurist. It was a private game of humiliation, a way of wounding without raising one's voice. Margaret reacted in kind. She began to drink more, to isolate herself, to answer her husband's provocations with sarcasm. But the more they drifted apart, the more they seemed bound by an invisible rope, a mixture of attraction, resentment, and emotional dependency. The marriage was an explosive combination, two strong, vain personalities, both accustomed to standing at the center of their own worlds. And within that luxurious home, love became a stage for conflict. Respect dissolved amid sharp remarks, and complicity gave way to indifference. Even so, to the public, everything still looked perfect. In photographs, they continued to appear radiant, smiling, elegant, admired. But the moment the cameras turned off, the heavy silence returned. Margaret sought refuge in drinks and music. Antony, in travel, in work, and in the discreet company that surrounded him. It was the perfect portrait of a relationship that no longer knew what love was, yet could not imagine life without the other. A marriage that blended charm with cruelty, desire with disdain, passion with poison. The kind of love that doesn't end with a single break, but with the slow exhaustion of two souls, destroying themselves as they try to shine at the same time. By the beginning of the 1970s, little remained of the love that had once united Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon. What had once been passion and glamour had turned into coldness and silence. They now lived in entirely different worlds. He among cameras, models, and artists. She among drinks, parties, and loneliness. Antony continued to captivate the worlds of art and fashion, while Margaret sought comfort in companions who could help her forget, even for just a few hours, the emptiness she carried inside. And by then, the marriage was nothing more than a performance. It was in this setting that the betrayals stopped being a secret. He, involved with women and, as some claimed, with a few men as well, lived a life increasingly bohemian and free. She, tired of humiliation, decided to respond in kind. Margaret began an affair with Rodney Llewellyn, a young gardener and aspiring singer of just 25, while she was already past 40. Rodney was gentle, simple, calm, everything Antony was not. And for the first time in many years, the princess seemed to laugh for real. But destiny, once again, would be cruel to her. In 1976, the couple traveled to the private island of Mustique, a paradisal refuge where Margaret often escaped from the pressures of the court. It was there that the romance came to light. A photographer, secretly sent by the British press, managed to capture images of Margaret and Rodney together, laughing, embracing, exchanging caresses on the beach. When the photos were published, the scandal was immediate. The images circled the world, and the princess once again found herself at the center of a storm. But this time, there was no denying anything. The monarchy now faced a broken marriage. What few knew was that Antony had his own secret as well. While Margaret was living her romance in Mustique, he was growing ever closer to Lucy Lindsay Hogg, his production assistant, an elegant, married woman who would soon become the new love of his life. The Earl of Snowdon seemed ready to move on. Right after the scandal, he announced the separation, without consulting Margaret, and without informing Buckingham Palace. It was a typically defiant gesture from him, cold, decisive, and at the same time, theatrical. The news was met with shock, not only by the royal family, but by the princess herself, who felt humiliated when she learned from the newspapers that her husband had declared the marriage over. The couple officially separated in 1976. 2 years later, in 1978, the divorce was finalized, the first divorce within the British royal family in more than 400 years. And only a few months later, Antony married Lucy Lindsay Hogg, just 5 months after his divorce from Margaret had been completed. And so ended one of the most tempestuous and fascinating marriages in the history of the British monarchy. A love that began with passion and ended with notes of hatred, betrayal, and loneliness. Two talented, vain souls who loved and destroyed each other with equal intensity. Margaret never fully recovered, and Antony, even surrounded by success and recognition, seemed to carry forever the weight of what he himself had helped to ruin. And even free, Antony would not leave behind the emotional chaos that followed him. During his marriage to Lucy, he maintained a parallel relationship with journalist Annie Hills, a married woman who would be his lover for more than 20 years. It was a secret, intense, and tragic affair, one that would end in the worst possible way, with Annie taking her own life in 1996. The 1980s arrived, bringing with them the heaviness of time and solitude for both. Princess Margaret, once the symbol of glamour and irreverence, began to fade slowly. And the Earl of Snowdon, once the portrait of audacity and brilliance, watched his life slip away between work and memories. Margaret never remarried. She lived surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. At parties, her laughter still echoed, though inside she had become a weary, bitter woman, a prisoner of her own image. The press, cruel as always, called her arrogant, unpleasant, a spoiled princess who refused to grow old. But in truth, what the world saw was a shattered woman who had loved too deeply, suffered too intensely, and become a hostage to her own past. The years began to take their toll. Cigarettes, alcohol, and excess started bringing serious health problems. In 1998, Margaret suffered the first of several strokes while in Mystique, her tropical refuge. Others followed, until in February 2002, she slipped away quietly, at 71. Her death marked the end of an era, that of a princess who was never perfect, but who lived with rare intensity. Antony learned of his ex-wife's passing through the royal family. He made no public statements, but those who knew him well said he was deeply shaken. For as turbulent as their marriage had been, there was a bond between them that even time could not sever. She had been an essential part of his life, and in some way, he had been part of hers as well. Margaret was buried at Windsor, near the tomb of her parents. After the princess's death, the Earl of Snowdon retreated into a quieter, more introspective stage of life. He continued photographing, though at a slower pace, and dedicated himself to charitable projects related to physical disability, a cause that had followed him ever since polio marked his youth. For decades, he worked supporting students and institutions devoted to accessibility, and many saw him as a man divided between ego and guilt, between the artist and the human being searching for some kind of redemption. In the 2000s, already an elderly man, Antony returned to being celebrated as a photographer. He received tributes, exhibitions, and retrospectives in major museums like the National Portrait Gallery, which showcased his work and consecrated him as one of the great figures of 20th century British photography. But behind the lights and applause stood a man aging in the company of his own ghosts. Lucy, his second wife, even after their divorce, remained by his side in his final years, caring for him with affection and patience. She knew the man behind the headlines, the brilliant artist and the difficult human being, vain and fragile. With time, Antony's health began to decline. The pain in his legs, old remnants of polio, grew worse. He appeared in public only rarely, almost always with a distant gaze, wrapped in silence. It was as if, at last, the Earl of Snowdon had grown tired of being the center of attention. On January 13, 2017, at 86 years old, Antony Armstrong-Jones died at his home in Kensington. He died peacefully, surrounded by a few family members. His funeral was modest, held in Wales, where he had been born. He was buried beside his ancestors, far from palaces, cameras, and scandals. And thus ended the story of a complex and fascinating man, an artist of undeniable talent, yet an unsettled soul, an irresistible seducer, yet incapable of being faithful even to himself, a man who loved the most rebellious princess of the monarchy, and who with her lived one of the most intense and turbulent stories in modern royal history. In the end, the Earl of Snowdon was, like his own photographs, filled with light and shadow, beauty and truth, a human portrait, all too human, within a world that demanded perfection.